And the multicast.
Do you like being in the multiverse? Or?
All right, here we go. Perfect. Well, we are now live and people are start joining in here. All right, so I guess let's go ahead and kick things off there, Dave. So welcome everyone to the Rewards Mastermind. And we're a place where we are rewards experts that want to get together to elevate the industry overall, and so that companies can look at some of those cutting edge techniques and so forth and adapt them to their organization. So welcome everyone. And so I'm here with Howard Niswitz. My name is Sam Reeve, and Howard Niswitz is my co-host. We're both comp experts with Comp Team. And we're pleased to bring to you our speaker today, Dave Needham. And so Dave Needham is he wears a couple hats. As you can see, he is the founder of Ojos, which is a technology company that brings in a lot of different aspects of talent management. It's a good way to have a 360-degree discussion and so forth, and making sure that there's peer-to-peer feedback. And so Dave is going to tell us more about that. And Dave is also a VP People Ops leader of a local Denver technology firm as well. So he has a lot of expertise in his work. And as you can see, that his main focus is to really drive and fulfill companies with their and having a more grounded HR mission. He believes in an environment where people can have those difficult dialogues, and is valued having that good communication. And as he shows here, he respects challenge and sees innovation and foster areas of trust and respect between managers and employees. And so I know that Ojos does a lot to lay the infrastructure for that. So I'm really excited to dive into details around those pieces. So today our topic is.
It's good to welcome Dave back. He's been a frequent guest of ours.
That's right. And we're going to be talking about creating a purposeful pay philosophy today. So Dave, I mean, I know that you've been on the People Strategy Forum and a lot of other types of podcasts, and you've been here at the Rewards Mastermind before, but would love to still dive into your background. I know there's a lot of our listeners may not have the benefit of knowing you. So first of all, Dave, tell us about how you got into creating your software at Ojos and compensation as a whole.
Yeah. I always like to start. I like having conversations. I heard this question a while back. Somebody asked me this, and I was like, "Oh, I'm going to steal that." And the question was essentially like, "Why do you do what you do?" Rather than "What do you do?" Like, so I don't ask people what they do. Like, that's not my first kind of inclination. It's why do you do what you do? Because I think it's funny, and it kind of takes people aback sometimes, because sometimes they've never even thought about why they do it. They're like, I don't know. It's just what I do now. I don't know. But one of the, when I look back to my career, when I chose a career, or when I, started going down this career path, one of the things I started looking back, even at my jobs, right? Things that aren't necessarily would be considered a career, but the things we did before we found our career sometimes. One of the common threads was I really enjoyed helping people be successful in whatever they were trying to do, whether that's get promoted, move to a different level. I was a wilderness guide for a year and a half. So, for some people, it was taking them up to 14,000 foot peaks, people from Georgia, from Florida, from South Carolina who'd never seen snow before. And helping them kind of achieve things that they've never been able to achieve. And, in doing that, I worked with a lot of different organizations and a lot of different companies as I kind of transitioned into my career of organizational development, people ops, talent development, that kind of stuff, trying to help, it started out early on in training and helping people be technically good at what they do. And then I realized that gets you to a certain spot, but usually after that first level of organizational, effort. You're now leading people, and it becomes how good you are with leading people. And one of the things that struck me as I was looking at performance management systems, succession planning, leadership development, I struggled sometimes because I would find people in leadership roles that tactically were doing the things that every book tells them they should do, but they didn't like leading people. And around 2011, I saw a research study that was done by Barrett Kohler. And it was essentially, the results of at least one of the questions was only about, 70% of managers don't like leading people. And I'm like, that seems like a problem. Especially when you kind of invert the ratio and you say, okay, well, if employee engagement, if we believe employee engagement is directly linked or very closely linked to manager-employee kind of relationships, and only 30% of managers actually like leading people, it shouldn't be a surprise that only about 30% of employees are engaged. And what I wanted to create with OHOS was a way to kind of flip the script, because every performance management system, every succession planning, every leadership identification process I had seen prior to that, it was very top down. It was other leaders picking leaders. And from my perspective, that's not how leadership happens. We all have probably worked on teams where there's either no formal leader, but you pick one, right? You find somebody that you trust. You're like when this person says we're going to go that direction, you're like, okay, I guess that's where we're going. I saw it in my wilderness guiding. I saw it in just kind of informal groups where leadership emerges kind of from the group, and people choose who they're going to follow based on a number of factors, one of which is competency, but a lot of it is on, does this person care at all about the group, and are they acting in the best interest of the group whenever they're making choices? And that's very hard to see from a high level, right? If you're not being led or you're not working within the team, it's hard to see that. So my goal with OHOS was to introduce that level of visibility for organizations as to who is actually doing the work, because we've all worked on group projects, whether that's at work or in school or whatever. And on the 5 group projects, there was at least one person, maybe 2 people that just were not pulling their weight. And then the other, but they all got the same grade, right? Or they were the one that was talking to the professor and getting all the accolades and put their name at the top of the author list of your report, right? And I think that happens in organizations too. And what I wanted to do is I wanted to kind of flip that and say, look, we need to get more feedback from the people who are being led and the people that others work with as to whether or not they would follow this individual, whether or not they're actually pulling their weight, or if they're leaning all of their success on the efforts of other people. So that's what OHOS was designed to do, is to create more accountability from a decentralized perspective, so that leaders could make better decisions on whom others want to follow and whom others trust and see as experts in their field, as opposed to who's really good at managing up, which I think it's a good skill, but it's a followership skill, right? It's not about leading other people. It's about how good of a follower am I to the people above me? And that often is what gets promoted. And it's like, that's not what leadership really is. It's a component of being a solid employee, a solid team member, but that we shouldn't be promoting people because they're really good at schmoozing the boss. We should be promoting people because other people trust them to lead. And I've always kind of held by the truism, if you look behind you and nobody's following you, you're not leading anything. Like, if nobody wants to follow you, you're not really a leader. You're a manager at best, which tends to be very tactical. And sometimes, I'm sure we've all done it. I'm one of the big reasons I created OHOS is, honestly, I was tired of quitting bad managers. So that was kind of the genesis behind it. And I think, sorry, go ahead.
I said that's super interesting, Dave, because I didn't realize that you were a wilderness leader, and lead groups out in the backcountry. So that's really interesting, and it gives you a unique experience as it makes sense now of your philosophy around OHOS and so forth, because I know when you're leading out in the backcountry, I mean, it's very important to really understand the team and its capabilities. You can't leave anybody behind, right? I mean, you need to you can only go as far as your weakest member, and so forth like that. So there's a lot of things to be considered in that type of environment. And when we're looking at organizations, and especially those smaller companies that need to build a cohesive team and develop people on the way, I mean, that seems to be a very helpful philosophy overall.
We could have a whole separate webinar on this.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, and I mean, even, from the perspective of, all of the decisions that, as a wilderness leader, yes, you're being hired or contracted to help somebody achieve a goal and get them to the top, but your primary concern is the safety of the group, and you have to make decisions based on how things evolve and how things change. And I think that's a big part of why OHOS became what it is that, for far too long, people were being rewarded for their gung-ho personality and to hell with the rest of the group. And let's see if whoever gets to the top of the mountain is the one we should promote. It's like, that's not who I would pick to follow. Not always. Like, if they took the whole team and everybody was safe and got to the top, great. That'd be the person I'd follow, not just the one person who beat everybody to the top.
Yeah, and like as a wilderness leader, trust is monumental, right? And
Indeed.
And that's one of the things that we're talking about today, that a compensation philosophy can start developing for an organization. It kind of brings us to a similar statement, a focus on what the vision is for our rewards programs, our compensation programs. And then to the extent that becomes more transparent to the organization, it can foster trust and so forth. So as we start on this journey and talking about and creating a compensation philosophy that really works well, I mean, first let's why is it important? Let's look back in some of those things. What are your vision of why a pay philosophy is so important?
I think so. I was talking with my wife about this actually the other morning, and she was talking about the company, we were talking about all that stuff.
Dave, I think we just lost your audio, just digitized there, so we might have lost it there real quick. Are you hearing that as well, Howard?
Yes.
So it's not as aesthetically pleasing, but it might be more effective once.
Yeah, I think you're there you go. Yeah, I think your head. Oh yeah, there it is. Yeah.
Night and day. All right, sorry.
Yeah,
I was trying.
It's hard to beat wired headphones.
Old school.
Yeah, they might make you look like Mickey Mouse, but it's
hey, I'll do whatever I can. I always have to be worried about this overhead light. It's like there's places to make sure people aren't blinded by the. There we go, just to make me feel better. Thanks, I appreciate it. Either that or Sam put on earmuffs. He's like, I'm not listening to this guy. But no, I think one of the things with comp philosophy is I think there are so many other things that we put intention around from a culture perspective, like what kind of values do we want to have, what type of mission do we want to have, what type of vision, all those kinds of things, even performance management, session planning. We abdicate comp philosophy to finance. And I think from the execution side, absolutely finance accounting needs to be a part of it because they're the one making sure that all the numbers match and all the I's are dotted, all the decimal points are in the right place and all those kinds of things. We absolutely need them to be a part of it. But coming up with a comp philosophy that is employee and engagement centric, that's not their bailiwick, right? I mean, just like you would not, and I have told my CEO this, I have told pretty much every leader I've ever worked with, like, you do not want me doing accounting. You just don't.
Yeah.
Like, it's a bad idea for everybody. Can I do it? Maybe, and it's going to take me 10 times as long. And is it going to be nearly as effective as somebody whose brain works that way and they've been schooled and trained in that and that's their experience? Absolutely not. When we're talking about employee engagement, employee attraction, employee retention, diversity, inclusivity, equity, all of those things tend to fall on the people ops leaders or the HR leaders of the organization. Yet we've either abdicated or neglected this one really crucial piece of all of those efforts by abdicating, comp philosophy to finance,
Yeah.
and saying, hey, you guys go ahead and figure out what our comp's going to be. And, we'll go from there and you tell us what we get to pay people. It's like, well, we know from practice that, they're not always plugged into the same data that we are, right? I mean, we're seeing the job postings, we're talking to candidates, we're getting their feedback of what their salary and comp expectations are. And, when we get word back from the comp department or the finance department of, oh, well, our range is up to $65,000, and you're talking to everybody and they're saying my comp needs are 85. And it's like, I don't know how to find you the person that we need for what you're saying we're going to pay. And all respect to finance and accounting, they're wonderful people and do awesome job keeping companies afloat. But it's not where this philosophy needs to originate. So a lot of times what happens is companies will end up with a comp philosophy that is by accident. And I say by accident, it's the unspoken philosophy that we don't want to make public, which is we are trying to get talent as cheaply as possible and keep people for as little as it's going to cost us. Which, to quote my CEO, is oftentimes penny wise and pound foolish. And, when it comes to equity, diversity, inclusivity, that type of approach is only going to persist any kind of equity gaps that we happen to have within the organization or within, just nationally, why there's a gender gap.
Yeah, that's a great perspective because, when we were thinking about finance, I mean, they're also often thinking about, okay, well, what's the budget? We need to put the budget together. How are we going to increase the run rate or the increases or cost of merit next year, that kind of stuff. But as you you just brought in, diversity and inclusion is a big factor, and that really is going to have an impact on the pay philosophy and on how you do everything from recruiting to succession planning to development and so forth. And that's interweaved in the pay philosophy, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And the whole idea and the purpose, like, first off, what is a comp philosophy? And essentially a comp philosophy is, it answers the why behind what employees are paid or the decisions that are being made around employee pay. And that, provides both hiring managers, recruiting, HR leaders, some guiding principles behind those decisions, but also helps you figure out how do we apply this to new employees coming in, as well as our existing employees, to make sure that we're not creating this weird kind of gap. And I think a lot of times there's two very different philosophies that aren't aligned between, we pay what we need to pay in order to get the talent we get, but then we only pay what we need to in order to keep the talent we have. And it's like, you end up marginalizing, or there's a loyalty tax that happens for people who've been with you for a long time, as they're getting paid less than people who've got external experience. So you create this weird, you, to some degree, you encourage disloyalty, right? It's, how do you get a raise? Well, you leave and then ask, threaten them, or you get an offer from somewhere else. You threaten you're going to leave and say, if you don't match the salary, I'm going to leave, which typically is going to hurt everybody. Like, you're already in recovery mode, and now the trust has been broken. It's people. And the other thing too, and it kind of goes along with that, is I think there's a certain naivety that the system is based off of, the 1980s data model. Whereas, with the advent of the internet and payscale.com and salary.com and Paycor and all these different, and Comparably and Built-in and all these different sites where you can go and publicly put in your job description and see what's the average of people getting paid in this role. Trust me, if you're not paying people close to the median, they're not stupid. They know it. They may be staying for a variety of reasons, but if you're not appreciating that, and you're hiring people in at a higher rate than your existing people are, how is that appreciating or encouraging any kind of engagement? It's a very misaligned kind of system if you don't have that philosophy in place.
That's right. And I think that a lot of companies mistakenly take an oversimplified approach. I mean, they think of, if I ask a company, well, what's your pay philosophy? They often say, oh, we pay competitively right around the 50th percentile.
Yeah, there's so many vanilla statements out there now. It's almost, like similar to mission statements of companies. They all seem to say the same thing, and it's like, what do companies need to do to differentiate themselves, or at least put something out there that has a little bit more meat to it?
Yeah. Yeah, it's definitely I think a lot of times recruiters have been culturalized or trained to kind of keep cards close to the vest, right? We want to retain the power in the negotiation. And I think that is one, it's being tested by, the new talent economy. And, you've got companies there. It's a very weird talent market right now. You've got companies laying off and hiring at the same time. You've got super low unemployment rates, but also very high kind of disengagement rates, which typically whenever unemployment is low, you've got low disengagement, like higher engagement rates. During a recession, usually engagement goes up and it's kind of going down. So it's a very funky kind of talent market. And I think, the idea of an employer keeping the power in the negotiation process, they're starting to realize, one, I think laws are coming into play that are trying to equalize that balance. And it starts the employee experience off with the notion of, we are not equal partners in this. I retain the power in this relationship. I am in charge of how this happens. And you do what I tell you to do. And it's like, that's not really where talent is at this point. That's why I think a lot of great talent is leaving organizations voluntarily. Even though there's kind of a skewed job market, there are a lot of people seeking out the opportunity to go, look, if you're not going to appreciate me here, I'm going somewhere else. And if you're not going to start this relationship in an honest fashion, to where it's mutually beneficial, what's my incentive to do the same? So it's no longer, people take what they can get. It's no, people are pushing back and saying, we've got a little bit more leverage than we had in the past, or at least we've realized we have more leverage than we used to. And, I think this is a way that companies can equalize that balance by taking the implicit comp philosophy of what we're doing internally and making something that is aligned externally that you feel comfortable sharing. And my whole purpose is, if companies can't share their comp, or at least their comp philosophy, that's because of fear. It's not because they don't know it. It's because they're afraid to say it out loud, because they know that it's not positive. Like, it's not something that's going to attract people. And it's designed around fear of losing that power edge. But the reality is, you've already lost it. The market has shifted. People are looking for more. They've got more information than you're assuming they have. It's illegal to tell your employees not to talk to each other about pay. And I think that's something that most companies, some companies are surprised to hear. It's like, you cannot have a policy that says you can't discuss your comp with your fellow coworkers. And when I talk about pay transparency, I'm not necessarily saying you need to say, oh, here's what everybody gets paid. And I don't think everybody wants that, because I think, and not to say that people wouldn't be interested, but I don't think that's when people say pay transparency, or I want more transparency in our compensation. I don't think people are saying, I want to know what so-and-so makes, and I want to know what so-and-so makes, and I want to know what so. I think it's more, they want more transparency to how those decisions are made, so that they can understand why their salary is what their salary is. Maybe if somebody else's salary is different, okay, why is that? So it's not arbitrary. It's not this black box, behind the closed doors. So we make all these, mastermind conversations of how do we dupe our employees. If we really want to increase and create an organization of trust, it's got to start with being transparent about how are these decisions being made and what's the philosophy that's behind it.
Yeah, and you're right, as you mentioned, the first place I start is, like you said, with recruiting. When I go and do it, just start to put a philosophy together for a company, that's the first thing I asked. I go to their recruiting and their leadership, and I say, what are you telling your candidates, that are coming in? I mean, are you, how you asking that, or answering that question of what is your compensation philosophy? What do you, how do we, and a lot of it goes beyond just saying, oh, well, we pay competitively. It's how do we think about, paying fairly? How often do we review comp to ensure that we're being paid competitively and so forth? But the topic today is, of course, creating that purposeful pay philosophy. And so when you, what are the first steps that you take, Dave?
I think so. There's a couple things, right? So first is just understanding why you need one. And I think a lot of companies don't. So they jump to, okay, how do I create this? Okay, well, first off, let's understand what we're trying to solve for. I'm a big proponent of start with the root cause. So what are we trying to improve? What are we trying to make better? If we're trying to close equity gaps, if we're trying to, help with retention, we're trying to help with attraction, those kinds of things. If those are the goals, that's where you've got to start. So you can just go, okay, what are we going to have to do in order to close equity goals or equity gaps? If we're trying to increase trust, right? Like, okay, well, then we need to make sure that we can publicize this, we can make it transparent and say, this is what we do. So I think, it starts there. And, I think a big chunk of this and why companies are even paying attention to this at this point and starting to think about this in a bigger way. I think one is, a few years ago, and it continues to be an issue, the idea of there's a wage gap, right? And we're getting more publicity, more news, more research around it. The research has been around for a really long time. It's just, with the Me Too era and, a bunch of other social movements that have really shown a light on, how, and I don't know why the word is discriminatory, sorry, how discriminatory some practices or, philosophies or practices happen to be at this point. So even though we've had all of this, talk about compensation equity, diversity, inclusion, equity, belonging, all that stuff, equity, there's a lot of ways you can think about it, equity, but one of the big ones is, this is worth as much as this. That's equitable, right? So how do we close that? And, I was doing just a little bit of research. So currently United States gender pay gap is still about 17.7%, which is better than it was a year ago, or even 5 years ago. 5 years ago, it was at 18%. So we've decreased it by 0.3%. We are still 35th out of 38 countries in the Organization of Economic, Organization of Economic Cooperative Development. It's about 38 countries. So France, Germany, UK, Colombia, Israel, Korea, a number of countries are a part of this organization, have been a part of it since the 60s. We are 35th out of 38. We are behind everybody except for South Korea, Israel, and Japan. Every other country that's a part of this, we still have a wider gap. Belgium is the tightest, and their I think wage gap's about 3.2%. And then racial gaps also are huge parts of this too. So if you're looking to close those types of pieces, you have to understand how percentage, especially internal comp philosophy, is going to affect that. If you're only doing percentage-based raises, you're penalizing anybody who came in lower than they should have. You're also penalizing anybody who's performing at or above average, if they happen to have come in below average. So those particular gaps have to be taken into account. The other things too, and what I start looking at first when it comes to creating different things. So one, yes, what are the gaps? We need to look at what's the current state and where are we trying to go. But you have to take into consideration what's the company size, what's the company stage. Obviously, if you have a huge company and you have these huge equity gaps, if nothing else, you have to recognize that it is going to take a long time to get you to parity, to where everybody is where they should be. And it's going to cost millions and millions of dollars. So that's not lost on me. Now, it doesn't mean you shouldn't do it because of the cost, because you've been enjoying these benefits of underpaying your people for a number of years or decades in some cases. So that's something that needs to be addressed. If you're an early startup, with VC funding and you're trying to hire top talent, okay, that's going to play into your comp philosophy. But making sure that you don't swing the pendulum all the other way. So there's that. There's the industry sector. Are you private, nonprofit? Are you, service industry, hospitality, tech? healthcare, what sector do you happen to be in, what's going on within that particular sector. And again, back to the root causes. So, healthcare is experiencing huge attrition right now,
Yeah.
because everybody's burnt out from, all the COVID pandemic and, those challenges there. So there's a huge kind of exodus from a lot of skilled people out of the healthcare industry. So retention is a huge piece to that. You've also got your business objectives. What are you trying to accomplish in the next, 3 to 5 years? And then, a big piece to start looking at once you have that information in play is what's the market data. And when I say market data, and this also goes to business objectives too, is are you hiring nationally or are you hiring locally? Because
Right.
there's a big discussion and a big, I think, division for some people between, well, do you adjust for where they happen to be? And it's like, well, if you're hiring somebody nationally, then you should be looking at the national average. Now, the fact that somebody lives in Wichita, like, okay, yeah, great. They live in Wichita. Does the value they bring to your organization change based on where they live? Like, no. But people will use things like cost of living as a defense of that. And what I tend to tell people is cost of living is not the market you're playing in. You're not buying a house. You're not buying milk. You're not buying a commodity that has local taxes and supply chain and that kind of stuff in a local market, unless you're just focusing on hiring talent within that market. If you're hiring nationally, you're dealing with the cost of talent, not the cost of living in a certain location. You're hiring for, this is what this talent is worth. This is what this talent costs nationally. And that's what you should be looking at from my perspective. So
Especially now,
yeah,
with more and more remote workers, does the company really care where the person is living?
Yeah.
Shouldn't matter.
Well, there's a lot of philosophies there, but before we jump into like the geographic,
and I kind of word vomited all over you. I'm sorry.
Yeah, no, a lot of stuff there. But before we jump into like geographic practices, I think that what you were getting at, the big piece is the first step in to identify what comp philosophy that you should have as an organization. You need to do an in-depth analysis of looking at the external market and also looking at your internal conditions. So the external market, as you mentioned, is like what industry you're in and so forth, understanding the pressures, the competitive pressures around some of the jobs that you're hiring, and in that aspect. But some of the internal things that you're diving into is first is what I typically consider is, how much pain is the organization currently experiencing in different areas? You kind of brought that up in some aspects. For instance, does the organization clearly articulate what their mission and vision is, and do people have confidence in the leadership? Is there good teamwork? Is that required in the organization? Do people work together? Do we have systems that people can easily get things done, or are they burdened with bureaucracy? Do people feel like that they're heard? Do they feel like their values are aligned with the company? These different things that a lot of HR practitioners call the employee value proposition. If any of those areas in your employee value proposition are weak or are painful to people, then you typically have to pay more for that, right? If you're gonna, you have to pay for pain. If it's hard to get things done in your organization because you're a startup and you gotta, and it's unclear on how you're gonna move forward, you need to pay for that, pay for that pain, or have somebody that's extremely motivated in and operating in that environment. So I think that's one of the big things, is understanding what's painful in your organization. What do you think, Dave?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, to your point, again, if your organizational culture is working, 50, 60 hours a week because those are your business objectives and that's what's required, then yeah. When you're talking about salary, most comp expectations generally are based off the assumption of a 40-hour work week, give or take, right?
Yeah.
But when you start going, 10 hours above that, 20 hours above that, weekends are no longer sacrosanct. When you're on PTO, you're not actually on PTO. if those are the cultural expectations, there's got to be a reciprocal kind of appreciation from that. And if you can't do that from a cultural standpoint, you're going to have to come up and do that from a compensation standpoint. Now, if I would argue from a sustainable perspective, most organizations that operate at that level, and you guys feel free to weigh in, but my experience has been those are typically VC-led high growth startups that are looking for an acquisition and an equity payout within 3 to 5 years. And then it's like that culture goes away, right? It completely changes to a larger corporate culture, or the people go away. And you no longer need that kind of a culture. So there's a temporary kind of mindset when it comes to that type of a cultural aspect, but you've got to pay for it. So it's not sustainable in the long term, generally, but from a temporary perspective, if that's the culture you're trying to create, or that's the culture you need to have to accomplish your business objectives, yeah, to your point, you've got to pay for that pain that people are going to endure, whether that be equity or in straight salary.
And that's also why the comp philosophy has to be tied to business strategy and objectives.
Yeah.
If you're creating it in a vacuum, it's not going to make any sense.
Right.
Also, your business stage. I mean, if we go, whether you're starting out and you're growing as a company, or you're going through that high growth phase, or if you are a mature organization that can has a huge talent pool, or developing people from within. So as as small startups, I mean, they're going to have to hire most people externally. And so they have to be a little bit more competitive, or aligned to that external market. But more mature companies that develop a strong employer value proposition, there's less reliance on the external market and more on what they're bringing as part of that employee value proposition. Is they offer more training, they offer rich benefits, they offer all these different things. They can rely on other things to kind of balance that out. Yeah. So it's different by company stage too.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think that's where, and I've had conversation with people, trying to help them even with salary negotiations around, new hires. And, the questions I start asking is, okay, if we start from a national database and say, okay, here's the market median, right? Here's the median. Now what you start doing is you start taking all those additional factors, whether, it's company size, company stage, industry, sector, business pain, business objectives, those kinds of things. And that's when you start shifting left or right of that median. And if you're a smaller startup that doesn't have a whole lot of training and development to offer, you've got to hire top talent in order to meet those business objectives. You're looking for really high level individuals that have a lot of experience and capability within their particular roles. And you're asking them to, work 50, 60 hours a week, or whatever it takes to hit those business objectives in a short amount of time. Your median is no longer at the median. Your median is now at the 75th percentile of that range. And you've got to structure your comp philosophy around that understanding. Now it can shift over time. Like you say, with, okay, great, we got to that spot. We're, moving, stages. We've got more development. We're a larger company. We have better culture balance. We have better work-life balance. We've got more development opportunities. Okay, maybe that starts to shift you back towards the middle. If you're a long-standing nonprofit and there is a huge amount of personal satisfaction, you're operating off of grants and off of a very different kind of financing model, maybe your median is closer to the 25th or 30th percentile. So you can start shifting, whatever those comp expectations or decisions happen to be based on those different factors. But you've got to start with some level of market data. And what I've typically told, so my response when I was asked, prior to pay transparency laws in Colorado and the range and all that stuff have to be applied, when people would ask me, like, what's your comp expectation for this role? One, if I got, that question early on in the conversation, usually my response is, well, I don't know enough about your company and about the role and what you're asking me to do. And even towards the end, I would say, my blanket statement was, look, if we both do our homework well, and we both understand what I can bring to the organization and what you need me to bring to the organization, we shouldn't be more than a few $1,000s off. If we're farther apart than that, one of us hasn't done our research. And trust me, when it comes to my compensation, I'm going to do my research.
Right.
So it's like, I'm not going to be unrealistic. I'm going to take all these things into play. But if you're not doing the same thing as an organization, that basically shows me you don't have a comp philosophy. You're kind of flying by the seat of your pants and you're going, well, let's see what we can do.
Yeah.
And you're kind of, it's the post and pray and saying, well, hopefully we'll get somebody who's okay with this pay. It's like, you need to do a little bit more research than that.
That's right. And I think it's very wise what you just mentioned, as far as it's not the same answer for every organization. So you may be more aligned with the market in some organizations and more aligned with internal pay fairness in other organizations. So, and that's the purpose of having that pay structure, or pay those pay ranges, that they're calibrated based on what you're trying to deliver. Some companies are, it's more important for them to have that internal pay fairness, so there's less strife internally when you're comparing pay than what the market will bring. Of course, the market, you can have very disparate pay rates based on how hot the job is, or the supply and demand of labor in certain locations as well. So that's a big factor to be considered, for sure.
Yeah, and I think that's where internal processes versus external processes shouldn't be, they should definitely be aligned. They're going to be slightly different because obviously you're dealing with a slightly different objective. Like, you're not trying to attract, you're trying to retain, and you're trying to make sure people feel appreciated and encourage longevity and those kinds of things. So it's an aligned objective, but it's still a slightly different objective. But again, I still think it goes back to what's going on in the market, because again, your existing employees aren't stupid. They, if they're in any level dissatisfied, they're looking, they're paying attention. They know what's going on in the job market, as well as sometimes as well or better than your HR professionals do, because they're more invested in it, right? Like, they're more invested in their comp than somebody in HR might be. But if you're not structuring your comp philosophy around that type of movement, again, you get into the situation where a few years ago, and with Invoke being a tech company, a lot of engineering rates were going, like, cost of labor was going way up really fast.
Yep.
Inflation at that point, obviously right now it's a little bit different, but inflation at that point was only like 2.5–3%. So it was kind of funny. My CFO came to me and said, what are your expectations for comp changes? And he's like, because cost of living is looking about 2.5–3%. I was like, yeah. I was like, I don't look at that. And he goes, well, what do you mean? I was like, well, are we buying a house? Are we trying to, provide compensation to our talent? And he's like, well, it's for talent. I was like, well, then I'm looking at cost of talent, not cost of living, because that's different. I was like, what's it going to cost us to keep and attract the talent that we need? And as far as what that's going to be, like, I don't know yet. I have to do the research. I have to figure out what the market's doing. And it's funny because a lot of times they want to narrow you down to a percent and then you operate off the percent. If you come at it from the other direction, I think most companies will be very surprised that the percentages are pretty close to the same. But you're going to find there are some people who are way off and way underpaid by 10 to 15%, and they need to be adjusted. There are other people that might be right at the median, and some people might be above the median. It's like, look, they're good. Like, there are, like, if we show them the market data and they're paid at the 80th percentile, it's like, we can't move as much for you. Like, we're already there.
Right. But that's another thing. I mean, go ahead, Howard.
I was going to say the demand for talent has no real direct tie to the cost of living. It's
right.
They don't go hand in hand.
Right. And then one thing is, and we're in a situation when we're talking about some economic factors. I mean, cost of living, inflation, and so forth, which we're experiencing significantly right now. And then we're moving into potentially a economy slowing down, or a recessionary type of environment where budgets are constrained and so forth. And so companies are being asked, hey, I have a limited budget, but costs are going up. And so how do I use this budget most effectively? And so I often challenge organizations to say, okay, well, what is your business objective? What are you in business for? What are you trying to accomplish in the next few years? What jobs are most important in achieving that objective? And so those are the areas that you're going to need to ensure that you retain your competitiveness and more than other positions if you have a constrained budget, right?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think, and this is, again, just more of a personal ethos than anything, is at the end of the day, if I'm an employee, I don't care what my percentage is. The first thing I'm doing, if you tell me I get a 4% raise, and it's probably the first thing you guys would do, is like, okay, well, get on the calculator. And it's like, oh, $26 more paycheck. Awesome. Whether that's 4%, 6%, 8%, it's like, it's the dollar figure that's going to matter. And I think if we operate from the percent side first, we're minimizing the employee experience of the entire process. And it's like, nope, we need to just tell them the dollar figure, and let's back into the, like, okay, here's the dollar figure, and let's back into the percent. Like, okay, we're going to give you a $5,000 raise over the course of a year. That equals 6.2%. Okay, great. Again, I don't care about the percent. It's the dollar figure that I'm looking at. Nobody thinks about, nobody says, oh, what do you currently make? Well, I make 6% more than I did last year. But how much is that? Well, I don't know, but it's 6%. People are, so if we start from the number perspective, it's more of an employee centric experience. And then you don't get into that weird stuff of, oh, you're paying somebody $23,000 or, $69,123.74 a year. It's like, just round it up, like, or round it down or something. I give them a number, right? It's like,
yeah, exactly. When I see companies that every once in a while they have pay that is down to the penny, and I'm like, what are you communicating with this?
Right. And again, it gets very much back to the idea of being penny wise and pound foolish, right? It's like you're calculating down to the penny. And if you think about that so if that's your practice internally, now let's take that and say, let's apply that externally. Would you take somebody's salary and say, hey, we would love for you to come work for us, and we're going to pay you 3.7% more than you're currently being paid? I mean,
or even on the other side, like you said before, we're going to give you a 3,998 more. It's like, right. What is that all about?
Yeah. Like, why are you so precise? It's like, well,
yeah. All right. So before we lose, I know we're coming up to the top of the hour quick, and I want to return back to the geographic pay differential conversation, because I know a lot of people out there are thinking about that in their compensation philosophy. So let's dig into this a little bit more. I mean, you were mentioning, Dave, that your preference is that we should be looking at more of a national approach because we're looking at the value of what that labor brings us internally as a company. Is that right?
That's my perspective. And again, if you're just hiring people out of the Denver market, sure. Like if you're requiring to be in the office, if you're in manufacturing, or if you're, in something that's very location centric, yeah, you can use the local market. But if you're even open to candidates in a national market, then the cost of talent is the cost of talent. It's not about cost of living in any particular city. And the demand for talent nationally in some sectors is just as tight as it is locally. And in other spots, you might be more constrained locally. So you might have to end up paying more if you're looking at a local market than you would at a national market. So I think a lot of times it's the question I would always have for companies who say, well, we need to look at the local market. My question is, okay, why are you looking at the local market? Like, what's your motivation behind that? And if it's just to save money, like, I get that. And there will eventually be a cost to that type of a philosophy. Like it's never a zero sum game. Like there's always something that gets lost in that particular aspect.
Yeah. Dave, what about if a candidate comes from a really high cost local market? Then what do? The national average won't hold in that case.
That's true. And, I think there's flexibility. There's always flexibility, and again, this is the philosophy that we've adopted. It's, we start with the national market median, and we navigate up as we need to in higher cost of talent markets, or, if that particular talent is substantially better and we can't find anybody else, and that happens to be what their comp expectation is, we can move up. But we don't move down, because we kind of go like, this is the baseline of what this talent is worth. If it requires us to move up from there for this particular individual, and that's who we really want, and we're willing to pay that cost for that particular person, okay, that's a case by case scenario. But I don't think we should devalue people because of where they happen to live.
Yeah.
And that, again, that's my personal perspective. I think, different organizations are going to view it differently, and that's fine. But the big question you need to answer for yourself is, why are you changing one direction or not the other? Like,
Exactly. Why? I mean,
yeah,
being able to articulate that clearly. And it's true. There's when we're talking, I mean, we're going to have a different session on geographic practices in the future, because there's a lot of complexity in here, that go from how big are you as an organization, how fast do you plan on growing, what markets do you plan on being in, all these types of things. And so it's definitely a detailed topic to get into, but I wanted to touch base on it a little bit here because it is a big part of the compensation philosophy discussion. Now, I know that we just have a few more minutes, Dave. I just want to capture any other pieces on your creating that purposeful philosophy. What other elements that we haven't talked about that you want to bring up?
I think those are the big pieces. I think, again, kind of going back to what are the pain points you're trying to solve for? Are you trying to solve for diversity and inclusivity? If if you have those type of efforts in your organization and you're not looking at your comp system and comp philosophy, that's going to have a big impact on how effective any of those efforts are going to be from a cultural standpoint. Because I'm a big believer that, processes and standardized practices that are rooted in something that caused the problem, if they're not being looked at, they're going to continue to, undermine any efforts you happen to take in that direction. If you're trying to, increase attraction or increase, trust in your organization, those particular things. So it all comes back to, if you can't communicate your comp philosophy, why not?
Yeah.
One, if you don't know it, obviously that's a problem that you need to address. But if you do kind of know what it is, you kind of have this like, this is kind of how we do it, but you wouldn't want other people to know that. Like, that's probably a problem too. So at any point, I'm happy to share. I mean, I can share it verbally. I can send it to you guys, what kind of our new employee comp philosophy is and what our existing comp philosophy is, as well as, what we share with our candidates in their job offer. Like, we show them the market data and we're like, this is where you are in relation to the market. And here's our comp philosophy. This is how all of this works. And here's what you can expect moving forward. So there's no surprises as people enter the organization.
Yeah. And there are a couple of pieces there. I mean, the transparency, I mean, a lot of organizations are not ready for a lot of transparency, and others want to be as transparent as possible. And so, yeah, definitely that needs to be considered. And communication, as you mentioned, communication is so critical of your compensation philosophy to ensure that you have trust and people to have confidence that you are competent in what you're doing, so that as an organization, because this is not something that we can hide or just not talk about. Pay is something that is so important to individuals because it determines their how well they can live their life, what they can invest in, and so forth. So they're going to be interested in it, and so we need to talk about that important piece that we're delivering as part of their rewards package, for sure.
Yeah. And I think too, the transparency and the ability to articulate what your philosophy happens to be allows you to push or at least enable your managers as you go down the cascade. It enables them to help explain and have those conversations with their people, as opposed to, and it strengthens that bond between the manager and the individual. If you can push this down to the level of, look, here's our philosophy, here's the market data, you have 4 people on your team in these particular roles, you tell me what you want to do.
Mm-hmm. Right.
That way the manager has a direct link to that person's compensation. They know how to have the conversation, because I've been in positions, and I'm sure you probably have too, where you want to give a team member this raise, right? You want to give them $5,000, $7,000 or whatever for the year. And HR comes back and says, well, no, you can only give them 3,000. And you're like, but they're my best performer. They're kicking ass. I know they're looking elsewhere. If I can't do this, they're not going to feel appreciated. Now I'm the messenger. And it's like, I have to deliver a message as convincingly as possible, even if I don't fully believe in it or support it. And I have to try and come up with all the reasons why they should be happy with this less than substantial raise that they deserve. Whereas if you explain the philosophy to the individuals, you say, here's the range, here's where this person is. What do you want to do here? And you can apply it much more consistently with much less headache.
Yeah. And that it just goes to say how important it is to have well-trained managers with effective communication with their employees, which brings me back to full circle to your software at Ojos. And it helps managers and employees have effective one-on-ones and effective performance management discussions. Can you tell us a little bit more about that in the final few minutes?
Yeah, so the easiest way to think about Ojos is it is a fully decentralized feedback and people analytics platform, in the sense that you're getting data and visibility from everyone happens to work with. So for the three of us, if we happen to work together, I could get feedback regardless of what my role is in the team. I can get feedback from all three of you. If I work with any of the people who are listening and kind of listening in on this podcast or on this stream, if they wanted to give feedback, they could give me feedback. If I work with them once a month, I can get feedback. If I work remotely and I rarely see my manager, but I work with this other team offshore, I can get feedback from them. And then it all filters up, down, sideways. It's what I call, it's inside and out, and up and down. So, or inside out and upside down is probably the easiest way to think about it. You can get feedback inside the organization, outside of the organization, up the organization, sideways the organization, and down the organization, which gives you a much more complete picture of how people are doing in their roles, who's contributing towards the success, and who's, for lack of a better term, leeching off of the success and efforts of other people, but kind of riding their coattails. And then how do you better identify people who are natural leaders that others would follow, so that you don't run the trap of, what is it? Not Murphy's Law. What's the Peter Principle of promoting people into their level of incompetence? Like, trust me, the people around other people will know where they should stay. It's like, great person, awesome at what they do. I will go to them for questions, not the person I would want to lead the group.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, great. Awesome. Now they're a subject matter expert. We've got data that supports the compensation adjustment there. Versus this other person we might reach out to that we might not have thought of because maybe they're quieter in meetings, but the group absolutely looks to that person for mentorship and leadership in the organization.
Yes. Well, thank you so much, Dave. And so how can people learn a little bit more about Ojos and how to get in contact with you?
Yeah. So if there's anything I can help with, whether it's, helping with comp philosophy and kind of working through that stuff, or looking at Ojos, my email address is dave@myojos, that's MYOHOS.com. Ojos does not stand for anything. It is a play on the Spanish word for eyes, which is OJOS, and pronounced Ojos. So I didn't want to correct everybody's pronunciation if I did OJOS. And the whole principle behind it is, it provides organizations with more clarity and much more visibility to where their talent happens to be. And it's all transparent and, it's anonymous, but transparent to the individuals as well. So I can always see in real time how I'm doing in the eyes of the people I work with.
That's great. Well, thank you once again, Dave, for joining us here on the Rewards Mastermind. It's been a great discussion.
Absolutely. Thank you, Sam. Thank you, Howard. I appreciate being here.
All right. Talk to you next time.
Right.
See you, everyone.
Take care.
Bye.
Bye.